Pod. Welcome back to another episode of Say Who, Say Pod. He's Danny O'Neil in a sports coat. I'm Christian Caple. It's March 11th, Danny. We're 20 days away from spring practice. Pro Day is this coming Monday. It's getting to the busier part of spring now.
Pro Days, you're going to have some people on campus for that. You're going to have some NFL teams that are very, very interested with Jonah Coleman and Denzel Boston running. There is going to be, there have been a lot of pro days with people there, but those are two guys that are potential, and in Boston's case, potential first round pick, and Coleman in potential first half of the draft that'll both have a lot of scrutiny upon them.
Perhaps more scrutiny upon Jonah Coleman from the hometown Seahawks. Kenneth Walker moving on.
They got a need at running back. Seattle's shown a willingness to dip into that well. I remember how pumped I was when they drafted Ben Burke-Kirven. Will Dissly, another guy that they dug out of UW.
It's very interesting. And by the way, Brandon Huffman from Rivals joins the show this week. Great conversation with him.
Very excited. He's been doing high school recruiting for an awful long time. His level of expertise and knowledge is pretty striking.
There's just, and I certainly don't mean to disparage any of the other great recruiting analysts out there, because there are several. There's just nobody better than Brandon. He's just the absolute best all the way around. I've been paying closer attention to how NFL free agency is covered in the transfer portal era of college football.
Why? Are you serious?
Yeah.
Why?
Because, and you tell me if I'm way off base here.
No, I'm interested to hear.
So what Kenneth Walker signs with the Chiefs on a 3-year deal with an average annual value was a $15 million.
Yes.
Up to $15 million. The Seahawks, fair to say, somewhat surprisingly bring back Rashid Shaheed.
Yeah, Shaheed, once free agency started, I would have told you it was more likely than not Shaheed was gone. But Shaheed was always more likely to return than Walker, in my opinion.
Boye Mafe signs elsewhere.
Yeah, that was a lot of money.
And in each of these instances, the scrutiny is 100% on the organization. They chose him over him.
Mm-hmm.
They paid this guy. They didn't want to pay this guy. Were the Seahawks right not to compete to pay Kenneth Walker what the Chiefs were willing to pay him? And it occurs to me that, like, college football fans need to get in this mindset.
Oh.
And that needs to be the discussion around more transfers, not all. But, like, nobody's talking about the Kansas City Chiefs poaching Kenneth Walker, right?
Yeah, no, they're not.
And there's no parallels to draw here to the Damon Williams Jr. situation, by the way. He was under contract. He'd signed a contract. Washington was perfectly within its rights to hold him to it. But, like, we have created annual free agency. And if you haven't re-signed for the next year already, and if you haven't signed a multi-year deal, you need to look at every player on a college roster as a prospective free agent. It's just unstructured, and it's not organized the way the NFL is.
Uh-huh.
And there are going to be guys who go in the portal who you think, oh, what? That guy he had a great freshman year. He was off to a great start. He was going to be why would he leave? He's going to be number one. And yes, it might be the case that another school or his agent or somebody back-channeled to him that, hey, if you go in the portal, this school can pay you more. But if you're a college football fan, you're still very much of the mindset that the default should be the kid comes back to your school. The default should be the kid stays at your school. The reality is they're all free agents.
Yeah.
Some of those guys go in the portal because it's been communicated to them that their current team is going to prioritize paying other players more, is going to prioritize other players at their position. They've made decisions about how to spend their budget. And I guarantee you that there are general managers and directors of player personnel at the college level who are looking at the roster and saying, we must keep these X number of players. We have this much money. I think we can make it happen where we can be the number one offer, or we can offer enough that we're going to keep all these guys. This group over here, Boy, I'd love to have
Yeah.
all these guys back. They're good enough to play here. They're good enough to help us win. I want them. It would be awesome if they all came back. But we have to be okay with some of them leaving because of how we've chosen to spend our money elsewhere. And that's all NFL free agency is, right?
Yes. I see where you're coming from, and I think you're 100% right. The decision-making process with Rashid Shaheed and Kenneth Walker is the type of decision that colleges are going to have to make all the time, which is which of these guys are we going to get down in the trenches and battle dollar for dollar to keep? And which are the guys that we're going to say, we'd love to have you, but we just can't go that far, and we wish you the best of luck. And the ability to sort of separate those types of players is a really important skill. I would spin it forward a little bit. We know in the NFL that free agency is the worst or least efficient way to build a team. It is an incredibly poor sort of way to use your resources for two reasons. Guys are more expensive and they're older. So that ramps up the risk of injury, or that they have accumulated injuries. We know this, yet every year when free agency runs around, you have these winners and losers, and oh my gosh, this team spent a lot. And there's never the question of like, is this the best way to build a team? Is this really going to translate? Last year, the Minnesota Vikings spent $300 million on contracts, like committed $300 million worth of contracts to 14 guys in the first week of free agency. And they became a worse team, in part because their quarterback sucked and they didn't bring back Sam Darnold. But those sort of things. And then every year, like no matter how many times you get burnt, teams still do the same. This year, it's like big orgy of spending with the Titans and the Raiders. And you never stop. Okay, is this actually, and that's my question with the transfer portal in college football. Is it going to work? Is it going to put teams over the top? We've seen that quarterbacks can make a huge difference. But is that going to be being very aggressive in the transfer portal? Is that going to be the recipe or going to have immediate success? And my suspicion is the more it goes on, the increase that you'll see where it's like NFL free agency, where you get headlines when the transfers happen, and that doesn't translate to victories in the season.
Yeah, like Indiana didn't win the title because they brought in a bunch of transfers. They won the title because they evaluated at the most elite level you can evaluate at with the transfers they brought in.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they didn't sign necessarily, like Fernando Mendoza was sought after, obviously, and there were others, but they didn't go out and sign the top 15 players in the transfer portal who every single school wanted. And, oh, well, yeah. I mean, geez, they just signed the 15 best veteran free agents available. Of course they won the title. You know, they won with a good handful of guys from James Madison, and they picked their spots elsewhere, and they evaluated like crazy, and they coached like crazy, and they developed like crazy, and they had a great team. So it's I think we're getting there. Just with regard to the way that I still think like the stigma, the perception, anytime someone transfers from school A to school B at the college level, it's that they're being greedy, that others around them are being greedy. They're just trying to get the most money because mentally we're still at a place. And I totally get this. I wish it were this way in a lot of ways. We're still at a place where like the default should be you stay at the school you're at. And if you make any decision to the contrary, it's selfish and you're greedy and you just want more money. Whereas in NFL free agency, it's just accepted that like, well, yeah, they're not going to be able to keep this guy.
Right.
Because he's so good. He's going to demand a number on the market that if you look at their payroll and their salary cap position, it's probably not going to make sense for them to pay.
Yeah, you're right. In college football, like the first is the players being greedy. The second question is the school broke, or why couldn't they keep him?
It's a good
It's
point,
never
too.
it's never that's just the nature of this beast. And there is a component of it that you're never going to get around guys transferring out for more money. It's going to happen because of how different schools' rosters and the needs of their coaches. Look, man, the one way to show everybody, like the best way to keep your job if you're a coach and or general manager, is to win. It's far and away, winning solves everything. If you don't win, the next best way to keep your job is to convince your boss you're doing everything you can to try and win, which translates to big fat payments in the transfer portal, right? Or in free agency. Like, look, we're out there doing everything we can. Is it going to actually translate to victories? We'll see.
And then number 3 on top of that, as Pete Carroll said to you one time, look, they're going to mess it up. Sometimes they're going to mess it up. They're going to make the wrong, sometimes they're just going to make the wrong decision. A guy who goes in the portal, you're like, that doesn't make any sense. Well, you're right. It doesn't make any sense. He probably should have stayed.
Yeah.
But, Danny, you know where they never mess it up?
Oh, I do know where they never mess it up.
Chuck Olson Kia in Shoreline, locally owned and operated since 1964, family owned and operated by a family of University of Washington graduates, with a friendly, low-pressure sales staff and a competitively priced selection of vehicles, and a Henry Olson, who you should speak to, who you should tell him, I want to buy a car, and also say Who Say Pod sent me, so that he knows that folks are listening to the show and believe in Chuck Olson Kia, as they should be. This episode of Say Who Say Pod also brought to you by our friends at Husky Mobile. Husky Mobile is partnered directly with the University of Washington to offer affordable phone plans for the Husky community, with up to 7% of each bill going back to UW Athletics. Subscribers can also enjoy game day perks like fast pass lanes, seat upgrades, and giveaways, all while on T-Mobile's nationwide 5G network. Use code ONMontlake at checkout to get your first month free when transferring your number. You can do that at gohuskymobile.com. That's code ONMontlake. Thanks again to Husky Mobile for supporting today's show. I really enjoyed our conversation with Brandon Huffman.
He's been doing it an awful long time, and it got me pumped up because he sounds very encouraged and optimistic about the direction that Jedd Fisch. This is the most optimistic and encouraging description I've heard of Jedd Fisch in 3 months.
Here's Brandon. Well, as I mentioned, we're very fortunate to be joined today by, for my money, the premier recruiting guru, not just on the West Coast, maybe in the entire country, maybe even all of planet Earth. Brandon Huffman of, and I'm still getting used to this, Rivals and On3, switch he made recently, was the national recruiting editor forever and ever at Scout, and then 24/7 Sports, now a national recruiting analyst for Rivals. Brandon, how are you doing? Thanks for joining us.
I appreciate you guys having me on. And yeah, it's still weird to hear people introduce me as being with Rivals, considering I worked against them for 23 years and now I'm wearing the gear. So it's a little bit jarring for even me.
Brandon, when you look at recruiting and how it has changed with NIL, how big of an impact does the financial considerations, like how much do the monetary offers dictate where kids end up going?
It's probably the biggest thing and nowadays. It used to be playing time, used to be coaching, development, quickest path to the NFL. Now it's the quickest path to the biggest payday. And it's no longer taboo to ask a kid to, hey, what's the NIL package? You just kind of, for 2 or 3 years there, it was kind of just assumed that there was NIL being involved. Obviously, there was the previous 20 years I covered recruiting where we knew it was going on, but in duffel bags of cash or in coffee cups. Now, you almost have to ask. It's not uncommon at all for a kid to say, well, my decision is going to be based on the financials. And it's not about development. It's not about the coaching staff, the stability, the facilities. It's about who's coming in with the best and most, robust opportunity from a financial standpoint.
How often do you think an individual recruit is simply picking the highest offer? Or is it a matter of like, these are my 3 favorite schools, these are the coaching staffs or the offensive or defensive schemes or the situations that I would choose a school based on if money were not a factor? I'm going to decide what my favorite is, and their offer's got to be within range of the top offer? Or do you see a lot of kids simply saying, what is the highest dollar figure? That's where I'm going.
Yeah, and I think that there's a misconception that every single kid in any particular school's recruiting class is there based strictly on finances. There are some schools that it's like a budget. You're still going to have, on a 25-man baseball roster, you're going to have your ace who's going to get paid X amount, but your 25th guy who might throw to 4 batters in a game is not going to get it. And he is just happy to be there. And in a lot of the cases, not every kid is getting $2 million a year. There's some guys that are getting essentially the equivalent of what the minimum revenue share will be for an incoming freshman. There are schools that are not even doing revenue sharing for freshmen. So I think people's perception is that, everybody is asking for top dollar. The reality is it's the top, 5% of a top 300 class that gets to kind of dictate the finances. So I still think there are a lot of guys that will pick a school based on the development, based on the fit into that offensive or defensive scheme, the coaching that they're going to get. But there's also going to be guys that will pick a school that maybe the logo is less attractive because there might be financial incentives at that school that they wouldn't get if they're the 20th player at a more blue blood school.
One of the reasons I was so excited to have you on, and we're really grateful for you joining us, Brandon, is your history in recruiting gives you sort of a unique perspective on where Washington sits now under Jedd Fisch and in the Big Ten, because so much has changed with the school over the past few years. Where do you see sort of their recruiting level? What's their weight division when it comes to the caliber of players they're able to recruit right now?
Well, it's fascinating that you asked that, because I think that the DeMond Williams situation may have inadvertently enhanced Washington's profile from an NIL standpoint, but also maybe hurt it from a sense. It made it sound like, oh, well, they're an impoverished program if they don't have the money. Well, LSU is throwing out money that would make the Dallas Cowboys blush. All right. So if you're gauging it based on that, then yeah, maybe UW doesn't have the financial vault that some of these SEC schools do. But at the same time, when it took a eye-popping number to say, hey, DeMond Williams may leave Washington because of this amount, but this is what he was getting in Washington, that might also raise eyebrows for some of the players saying, oh, okay, Washington, I wasn't familiar with your game. I didn't understand you do have deeper pockets than maybe you thought of. And I will say that when Kalen DeBoer was the head coach at Washington and their recruiting was obviously a little less glamorous. And part of that was because there wasn't seemingly a focus on national guys. There was seemingly more of a focus on California guys, given general manager Courtney Morgan's ties to Southern California. They weren't necessarily going after the big names. There was maybe this feeling, well, Washington just doesn't have the money. There was, talk. I remember at one point, Edwin Ulofoshio was the second highest pay, or had the second highest NIL on the team. And that caused consternation with, well, how does Rome Odunze and Jalen McMillan not have that? I think that's changed, because I think Jedd Fisch came in with the understanding that, guys, if you're moving me to the Big Ten, when he gets there, they're in that transition going from just playing for national championship out of the Pac-12 to now being in the Big Ten his first year. It was with the understanding that, like, if you're going to expect similar results in the Big Ten, you're going to have to provide the resources available. So I think that Washington has gone from being a plucky team, if you will, with a lot of guys that were the homegrown talent like they had on the national championship game squad, to now saying, hey, these guys have the resources to be competitive with anybody. And I think you saw that in their 2026 class, where it ranked in the top 15 in the country, why they're able to win recruiting battles, going into Texas to get a guy like Jordan Clay away from Baylor and the deep pockets that Baylor has to get some of these players that they got. It showed that Washington has the resources. And we don't have to say that anymore, like, oh, good, Washington's only doing this. Every school is doing it. Every Power 4 school is doing it. And the ones that are claiming poverty will be the ones playing at the stay-at-home.com bowl and not be competitive and looking for a new coach in 2 years.
The point about everybody knowing DeMond Williams Jr. is getting paid $4 million, and how I feel like the way that all went down, it's natural for folks to only look on the negative side of that. But maybe the plus side is everyone around the country is going, oh, Washington can pay its starting quarterback $4 million. It reminds me of when they were recruiting Lincoln Kienholz, the quarterback from South Dakota, who was committed to them for a long time and flipped to Ohio State before signing day. He transferred to Louisville, I want to say. And he made a remark to a local TV station there at the time that, Washington had better NIL. Washington had a better offer than Ohio State, which raised some eyebrows, but Ohio State has better development. I want to go to Ohio State. And that really bothered a lot of Husky fans, understandably so. But I remember talking to somebody at Washington at the time or around that time, and they said, hey, that didn't hurt our feelings at all. Like, if Lincoln Kienholz wants to be out here saying Washington's got better NIL than Ohio State, like, we wish he'd come to Washington instead of Ohio State. We wanted him, but that's a good thing for us if people believe that. So it's just funny how far it's come, because I remember Ryan Grubb saying, like, Michael Penix Jr. quite well compensated his last year at Washington, but came to Washington for $0. Like, that was not a top bidder out of the portal situation. So regardless of how they're doing it, obviously, like, Jedd Fisch and his staff recruited really well at Arizona, especially in the 2022 class. That was kind of a landmark year for them. A lot of those guys wound up at Washington and were a big part of Washington's team last year. Did you expect them to recruit at this level coming to Washington?
I did. And I think the biggest reasons for that is because Jedd Fisch had a staff that knew how to recruit at a school that football was something that you did for 3 months to get out of the heat and to kill time until basketball season started. And when he came in that first year in 2020, to be the head coach right after that 2020 season, remember too, there was a complete pause on recruit. I think today is like the 6-year anniversary of the world getting shut down because of COVID. Well, that impacted recruiting. So not only does Jedd Fisch come in having to clean up the mess that Kevin Sumlin gave him, he's got to do it without any real film, any real ability to evaluate and scout guys. And so when he gets that job, I want to say it was like December of 2020, California hadn't started playing football. Washington, Oregon hadn't started playing football until a few months later. So he's having to watch guys, try to recruit guys without film for 13 months. There was a player that they got that ended up being a second-round draft pick, Jonas Savaianaya. Hawaii didn't play football at all that year, but Brendan Carroll and Jedd Fisch took a chance on him. He turns out to be a 3-year starter at Arizona, goes in the second round as a true junior in that 2022 class because they just based it off of a lot of the metrics. So they were doing a lot of that evaluation and that recruiting blindly. They weren't able to get out on the road. They couldn't go out on the road in the spring. Recruiting got shut down until June. So to see what they did at an Arizona that was known more for basketball, and to see what they did in that very first class, to get it to Torrey McMillan and flip him from Oregon when Oregon was still kind of at the height of their game under Mario Cristobal, to get him to go away from USC, they were showing signs. So now he comes into Washington, fresh off them playing for a national championship. I don't think the average high school recruit would say, oh, well, Kalen DeBoer is no longer there. Washington's going to drop. They remember that 2 weeks before Jedd Fisch got the job, Washington was playing for a national championship. So that's where the name on the front of the jersey meant way more than the name on the back of the jersey in terms of who was recruiting him. So he brings in a Kevin Cummings, who, and I said this back in December, Kevin Cummings is sneakily, and it's no longer sneaky. He is, I guess, quietly doing one of the best recruiting jobs of any position coach in the United States, not just a best receiver coach in the Big Ten. He is starting to put together a heck of a resume of what he's doing as a receivers coach. You see what Michael Switzer has been able to do on the offensive line. Jason Kafusi, he took some shrapnel last year for some of the misses that he got. And then you look at the class he ends up with, he did that same kind of stuff at Arizona and at UCLA. So he's got this staff. And then what I really think where Jedd made the best decision was bringing a guy like Marcus Griffin onto staff. To get a guy who was still relatively young, who was from Seattle, who had connections. He was single-handedly the biggest reason that Cody Green flipped. Yes, Michael Switzer helped. If Brendan Carroll's still there, do they get Cody Green? Maybe not. But understanding the need to have a robust personnel department had allowed Washington to really make inroads with a lot of guys that maybe they were lagging behind in the 2026 class. And now you're seeing this past weekend, they were able to have kind of an elite, very small, very exclusive junior day with some elite prospects from all over the West Coast coming in, including the number 2 player in the country for 2028. So that's the kind of stuff that you can see that Jedd Fisch knew exactly what to do. He just needed a stage and an opportunity to do it where football is keen.
Brandon, it sounds like you're pretty optimistic about where Washington is right now and where they're headed. Is that kind of an accurate summary of how you see the program?
Very much so. And I think that, I think the best way to look at it is this, that, the results on the field went from mediocre given the circumstances where they were at in 2024 to improving in 2025. They still got to, solve the Oregon problem under Jedd Fisch, but it's no longer going to be a talent issue. It's no longer going to be a personnel issue. And I think that, Jedd Fisch is the kind of guy that he's got a ton of energy for a head coach. You don't see a lot of head coaches that recruit with the vigor that Jedd Fisch has. Okay. You see a lot of assistant coaches that do, a lot of personnel department, but you see Jedd Fisch in a lot of these pictures. You see, him on these campuses in January doing the in-home visits. And I think there's a reason, if you're a Washington fan, to really feel good, because quite frankly, they have not had a head coach who's recruited with this much energy. Obviously, Christian, I love Chris Peterson and everything that he stood about, but Pete was very specific in the kind of player he wanted. All right. It was the whole OKG model. And, as nauseating as that cliche got over years, it was very specific, very key, and it helped build that roster that played for national championship. Jimmy Lake was a bull in a china shop and turned off everybody who tried to be recruited by Washington. He was not that guy. Kalen DeBoer was going to be the guy that was going to be the tactician. But Jedd Fisch is the closest thing to Washington's had since Steve Sarkisian in terms of what he does as a recruiter and his ability to evaluate, but his ability to close and engage. So the personnel is going to continue to be good, but he also understands the need to have just as aggressive and energetic assistant coaches. Some of the previous staffs had assistant coaches that were essentially there to coach X's and O's and not do much else. And in a time where coaches are needed less and less to recruit because of personnel department, Jedd Fisch makes sure that he gets good guys in the personnel department to do the extra lifting that maybe those assistant coaches don't. So I think if you're a Washington fan, you got to be nothing but optimistic about what Jedd Fisch has done and what Jedd Fisch is doing.
It's really interesting you mentioned the energy, because one of the observations I've had, and this probably is more in college basketball than college football, but with NIL, you saw a number of veteran coaches who kind of decided, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm convinced that's part of why Nick Saban stepped away. Like, he had it set up, but I'm not going to reset how the entire system and adapt to these new rules. It seems like Jedd is part of the generation of coaches. He's fully leaned into, this is the new reality, and I'm going to do everything I can to get the most out of it.
And you think back to before he went to the UCLA offensive coordinator job, he was the quarterback's coach at Michigan. And that was the 2016 season. If you remember, there are rules now in place literally because of what Jim Harbaugh was doing that whole offseason of 2016, going to Alabama for a one-day camp just to tweak Nick Saban, going to the Bay Area for a camp at a high school just to see Najee Harris, taking his shirt off at these camps, climbing up a tree. I mean, players were talking about, oh, Jim Harbaugh is literally staying the night at my house on an in-home visit. So when that's what's modeled to Jedd Fisch in one of his last jobs, and even goes to UCLA, and Jim Mora was a very energetic recruiter at that time, when he's in the collegiate game and then coming from the Pete Carroll coaching tree and see what Pete Carroll did in his time at USC, everything that Jedd Fisch kind of had seen had been modeled to him from a head coach was energy, energy, energy. If this is your program, you've got to put your own stamp on it. Okay. There are a lot of coaches that are now claiming, oh, college football and college basketball are so bad. No, what it is that you're getting caught up with because everything's equal. All right. You had a talent advantage because you had a financial advantage. Now, Nick Saban probably could have coached with, a team that didn't have the resources at Alabama. I'm never going to ever question his ability, and, but it's a fool's errand to think that, Nick Saban got out just because, he was jaded with college football. It didn't hurt that Kirby Smart had already passed him, or at least caught up with him in that current time frame when he stepped away. But for $9 million, $10 million, $12 million, a lot of coaches are going to suck it up and say, hey, you know what? I can coach. But it's guys like Fisch. And Washington fans are going to hate hearing this. Guys like Dan Lanning, Mario Cristobal. You look at those coaches that have been in the playoff hunt for the last couple of years. They have that head coach, Lane Kiffin. As Lane Kiffin is very methodical and calculated in what he tweets, and he's got that same energy. Well, who was his mentor? Pete Carroll. Why is Steve Sarkisian the way he is? He was a Pete Carroll disciple. So you look at a lot of these coaches that they put their own stamp on their program, and it is the energy, because ultimately you're going to be judged by your wins and losses and the personnel you're bringing in. And so if you're Jedd Fisch, do you want to leave it in the hands of just your personnel department? No, you've got to be just as energetic. There's a reason that Pete Carroll had the success that he did. There's a reason that Jim Harbaugh had the success that he did, because those guys ran their program, but they were just as involved and invested into the personnel acquisition as the assistant coaches were.
So obviously Cody Green is a local guy, played at Eastside Catholic, but spent the last 2 years of his high school career at Mater Dei. Washington has not signed a lot of 5-star left tackles from Mater Dei. Going to go out on a limb and say he's the only one without doing any research. Is there a similar prospect in this 2027 class who they are in on, who they have a legitimate shot at, that would be of a similar landmark status of like, wow, Washington got so-and-so, that would really that would be a sort of recruit to build around in the same way that Cody Green was in 2026?
Yeah, I mean, again, a guy like Cody Green is, I don't want to call him a unicorn, but he's a little bit of a unicorn in the sense that they went down and they got him out of Mater Dei, but he was a local kid, but he was not the player that he was coming out of Mater Dei when he left Eastside Catholic. He was a good prospect coming out of Eastside Catholic, and then he became an elite prospect based on the year. That's to say nothing about what Eastside Catholic did. It was also him growing into his body. But do I see them getting a top 20 type player? Right now, I'd say probably the closest to that would be a guy like a Gavin Williams, who's a top 100 player out of Damien High School in Laverne. And I kind of comped him a little bit to Dylan Robinson. Now, Dylan Robinson was a little bit more of a late bloomer who really blew up in the spring of his junior year, whereas Gavin's been a high-profile guy since his sophomore year. But, considering the schools that are going after Gavin Williams that heavily covet Gavin Williams, he could be that guy. And he's a guy that I think is only going to trend more north as the season goes on, as the spring goes on, as he gets to more events. So he's kind of that big, national. But again, over the weekend, they had the number 2 player in the country, or the number 3 player in the country per the Rivals Industry ranking, in Jelani George in the 2028 class. Now, here's a kid that is from Arizona. He's already got one teammate, Zarek Sidney, who's committed to University of Washington. Washington is making a push for his teammate and quarterback, Blake Roscoff. Washington has had great success, or Jedd Fisch specifically has had great success in the state of Arizona in recent years. So it's a 2028 recruit, but just getting him on campus. Now, let me give you an insight of where Jelani George is spending the rest of March. Oklahoma, LSU, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Georgia, and Auburn. All right. And then he went to Washington last weekend. So as he's getting ready for this big SEC visit, he spends the weekend in Washington. So that's one to put a pin on and see if they can continue to make waves there. So Gavin Williams might be kind of the big namer out-of-stater this year, but I'm really impressed by the fact they got Jelani George to campus and they made that much of an impact to get him up there for an unofficial visit. So that's a key one for me.
It's interesting, Brandon. You're looking at recruiting now and thinking about the transfer portal, which, I mean, especially with some of the quarterbacks that have switched recently. From your perspective, national perspective, is recruiting and recruiting out of high school as important as it was 10 years ago for major college football programs?
Well, I would have said yes before the 2025 season, and then Curt Cignetti ruined everybody's perspective on everything. And every fan base now thinks, well, if he could turn around the losingest program in 2 years and win a national championship, my program, with all of its history and tradition, should surely be able to do it. Let's call Curt Cignetti what he is. Speaking of unicorns, he is the unicorn outlier to every single thing that were ever said. If you look at the previous national championships before Indiana this year, Ohio State, yes, they had Will Howard come in as a transfer, Quayshawn Judkins was a transfer, but the majority of that core roster for Ohio State, Emeka Egbuka, JT Tuimoloau, Jack Sawyer, those guys were homegrown players. The year before, when Michigan and Washington played, yeah, you had a Michael Penix and a Jalen Pohl, but Washington and Michigan were heavy, developed by that program, brought in as high school recruits. Georgia, the 2 times before that, heavily dependent on high school recruits. So that said, yes, I still think there's an importance in high school recruiting because you want to develop those guys. The problem that programs are now having is keeping those guys. And so if I could be the best program in the country, All right. Miami has not had a problem recruiting high schoolers since Mario Cristobal got there. What was he having a problem doing? Winning games, finishing off games. So as great as, you know, some of the homegrown talent was on the team, he needed a Carson Beck to get across the finish line. He needed a Cam Ward the year before to be a 10-win team. So yes, high school development is important. High school recruiting is important. And every coach is going to say that because A, they don't want to tick off the local high school coaches, but B, they still want to bring in 20 to 22 guys. But now it's a matter of holding on to those guys because the patience from players is waning. It's lacking. Why go be a backup for 2 years at a school that has a gritty, pretty logo, blue blood logo, when this other school is going to pay me X amount, despite me not showing anything to crack the depth chart for 2 years? They're going to pay me how much to go and I get to finally play? I'm going to do that. So yes, coaches still want to recruit high schoolers, but by forces kind of outside their own. Now, granted, a lot of these coaches have put themselves in this position because they aren't doing a good job developing. So they have to pivot to the portal for those key positions. But I still think coaches would rather tell you that outside of year 1 or 2 in a rebuild project, I want to rely on high schoolers. So I do think it's still important. And the reality is, if you're a Washington fan, okay, if you're from the state of Washington, the Big Sky is the best FCS program in the country. There's not been any conference at the FCS level that has sent more guys to the FBS level out of the portal than the Big Sky. So those guys from the Big Sky had to come from a high school somewhere. So whenever I hear somebody say, oh, high school recruiting is dead, no, it's not. It's just maybe being recalibrated at the level where you're signing out of high school, but you still got to be a high school football player to sign somewhere. And now schools are saying, hey, we like that guy, but we didn't really love him. Now we have 2 years of film of him in the FCS and the Big Sky absolutely destroying teams. Now we love him. Now we want to recruit him. Now we want to offer him.
I hear from subscribers who say, hey, I wake me when it's signing day and these guys are on the roster and they're on campus. I can't follow all the twists and turns. Money's involved. Some of these guys are going to transfer before they even play. Plus, my school is going to bring in all these transfers who I know are going to play right away. So, I'm more excited about the free agent acquisition, so I know we're going to see the field. I was talking though to someone recently who's has followed recruiting maniacally for decades and offered sort of a counter to that, which is that high school recruiting has never been easier or less stressful to follow. And the thesis is that the calendar is so tidy that you look at Washington, right? They just had this huge unofficial visit weekend. And, these 30 plus guys who were on campus last weekend, that's not every prospect that they really want in 2027, but it's a lot of them, right? And it was kind of the same process in 2026. You're starting to see their official visit weekends form. Obviously, June has become, the last weekend in May and June has become the big month for that. And so that there are fewer, I guess, recruiting events in a shorter period of time that are going to form the backbone of a major program's recruiting class. And that also maybe the advent of NIL and revenue sharing and numbers being offered and agreed upon, at least verbally, right? Because you can't do it in writing until August, which, whether teams are following that or not, who knows? Maybe the money involved has made it so that flipping the week of signing day is harder to do. It's harder to do as a prospect because you're so locked in to this number you got your plans made, and it's harder to do as a school because maybe you've budgeted your payroll out multiple seasons, and the idea of now trying to get money together to walk away from one kid to take another kid, let's just take who we've got. Now, obviously Washington added, you mentioned Jordan Clay, Trez Davis, I believe JD Hill, David Schwarzel last year in that last. So it's not like you're just done by June. But I don't know. Do you see that from your position? Is it less hectic? Are you seeing less movement the closer you get to signing day, whereas maybe in years past it was more of a free for all?
I hope you guys don't mind how much time I'm taking up on answering each question because this is a great question. I'll let people in on a little bit of a secret that's pretty well known. A guy's not getting paid when he gets to campus in January. A lot of these schools are giving allowances ahead of time. That's why you're seeing commitments happening sooner and sooner. We grew up in an era, Danny, you and I would talk in late January because signing day was in February. You would wait. All the heavy lifting and recruiting was done in December and January. Now, the real unofficial signing day is almost like the 4th of July. That week leading up, so many guys are making that decision by the end of June, by that first week in July, because the official visits are done. Recruiting shuts down by the NCAA for all of July, all of August. You can't see these guys on campus until September. These coaches want to be done with their recruiting class. So we're talking about the 2027 class. These coaches would love to have 90 to 95% of their class done by the 4th of July. That way, all they have to worry about come fall is their actual season. Guys are committing on their first visit now instead of their 5th visit. Guys are making that decision in mid-April rather than late June because they know that the value of their NIL deal is going to be heavier and higher earlier in the cycle than the longer you wait, because there is a budget that you're pulling from. So if I'm not ready to make my decision in April, that offer that I'm weighing in April financially may not be as great from that same school come June, because now they've had other guys take a piece of the pie, or that school might not even be an option for me, period, anymore. So guys are making decisions earlier and earlier because of the value of that offer early on. And the other thing is with so much of the heavy lifting done by the end of June, that allows schools to then say, okay, this fall, when we have game day visits, it's going to be juniors and sophomore. So we can start getting ahead with those guys. So that way come January, we can start turning up the heat on them for the spring. You have a situation like Jared Curtis, who was committed to Georgia for a year. And, did Vanderbilt take care of him financially? Yes. Did it also help that Diego Pavia was probably not going to get his 13th year of eligibility in college? Also, yes. Did it hurt Georgia that Gunnar Stockton was coming back after having a pretty good season, including an SEC championship? Also, yes. So the aligning helped Vanderbilt keep a local kid because Georgia was no longer going to be an opportunity for him to start as a true freshman. Vanderbilt now had an opportunity for him to come in and start as a true freshman. Vanderbilt was also able to say, hey, you know what? We'll put all of our eggs from a financial standpoint in the Jared Curtis basket, whereas Georgia said, cool, you're a good quarterback, but Kirby's a defensive guy. We're going to pay our edge rusher just as much as we're going to pay our starting quarterback. So, yeah, you're going to have some late flips still. You're going to have a Jordan Clay type situation. Is Jordan Clay flipping to Washington because, Washington's paying more than Baylor? Probably not. Is he flipping to Washington because Kevin Cummings is doing a fantastic job of recruiting receivers and Dave Aranda is again on the hot seat and the Baylor offense is not very great? More likely. Okay, so there's still some late movement based on coaching stability. If there's a head coaching change, if there's a coordinator change, it could also be the depth chart. This guy that I thought was going to leave for the NFL is not leaving. Now I have a longer pathway to get to play than I will at another place. But the majority of the heavy lifting will be done in June. And like you said, Christian, the calendar is so tidy now. Coaches cannot be on the road. They can't even have got recruits on campus in February. So January, we used to see in-home visits with the class that's about to sign. Now schools are doing the in-home visits with juniors. All right. February is completely dead. You can't be on campus. You can't come to campus. March, you can host guys on campus. Mid-April to late May, you can go do the evaluation period, but you're also hosting official visits. June, you've got camps, you've got official visits. Then come June 30th, everything's dead for 3 months. So coaches are less and less on the road. And that's why everything's kind of fitting and forming into one much more compact calendar, because there's so much asked of coaches. And nowadays there's position coaches that may never talk to a recruit they're signing. That guy did all of his, and he may not ever talk to the general manager, his agent. Remember, every high school kid now, for the most part, elite high school kid has an agent. So instead of the head coach sitting in your living room eating mom's home cooking, trying to convince you and your spouse, well, this is why your son needs to come here, the head coach and that player may not talk until that kid gets there in August of his freshman year. It's now the general manager and the agent negotiating to decide this is where that kid wants.
Got one more for you, and I'll let you get going. We know about Cody Green. We know about Derek Coleman-Brusso. We know about Brian Bonner. Is there anybody in this 2026 class who Washington signed who you think people should be talking more about, who's maybe not as big of a name, who you've scouted, who you've talked to, who you know what the opinion is of him in the personnel and coaching world, that makes you think, this kid's going to see the field sooner than later?
Yeah, I mean, well, I was going to say, it is a dumb name to say because he was the number one player in the state of Washington for 2 years since Cody Green left, and I don't think he's ever gotten the love and attention he deserves from Washington fans. That's Derek Coleman-Brusa. I mean, he is maybe the most underappreciated. And you guys covered Washington enough. I mean, Christian, you were covering the Sark years where it was all about the fence, and there was a gigantic hole in the fence that allowed the Josh Garnetts and the Zach Banners and the Miles Jacks to leave the state, and then it existed again under Jimmy Lake. Derek Coleman-Brusa is the number one player in the state, and I don't think he ever got the love from maybe the fan base or appreciated because, when his brother committed a year before and signed, maybe it was kind of a foregone conclusion. So, he's kind of doesn't necessarily answer your question because he is high profile. He was a top 20 player. He was the number one player in the state. But here's the name that I'm going to give. And this is a kid that I think, what I've seen from him from a developmental standpoint to, what he was when he first got to the state of Washington going into his junior year to what he left the Polynesian Bowl in January and ended up being a 4-star as all said and done was Ramzak Fruian. And completely overshadowed. First of all, nobody really knew who he was when he got to got to Bethel his junior year because he had come in from Hawaii. Everybody knew who Zadrius Randy Saleh was. He was the number one player in that state. He was the focus of everybody's attention. And Ramzak was still kind of growing into his body. He was, this long, lanky athlete, kind of looked like a baby giraffe at times, and didn't necessarily play like a guy who was 6'4", 210. And he thought he was a safety. He thought he could be a safety, moves up into the box, has a really good senior year, goes to the Polynesian Bowl, and is fantastic. And as that light bulb went on, you start to see, dude, Washington got a steal with him. This is a kid that, has a NFL ready body right now. And by no means am I saying he's ready for the NFL. He might not even be ready to play in the Big Ten as a true freshman, but you can't teach that size and that athleticism and that frame that he has. And again, he's still so new to, the position of linebacker, but he's got that safety, that DB kind of twitch, that anticipation. And as he continues to put on the weight, this is a guy you can put in coverage against running backs in the Big Ten. You could put him against tight ends. You could put him in the slot, and he's got that DB athleticism that he can cover some of those slot receivers. I think that, again, because he didn't become a 4-star until after signing day, it might have been, oh, cool, we got him. He was committed to UCLA. They got him late. I think that Ramzak Fruian may have as much upside, if not more, than just about anybody else in this class for the Huskies.
Yeah, he's one where you watch his film and are like, man, what am I missing something? This guy's huge. He's physical. He's instinctive. They dropped him into coverage so much. I mean, you mentioned him, maybe earlier in his career thinking he could play safety. You almost kind of wonder if he can, as much as they asked him to do that. So yeah,
he still thinks he can.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, hey, if there's any ability there, I'm sure Ryan Walters will find a way to tap into it. They like their long, versatile athletes. Hey, Brandon, thanks so much for joining us, man. You have always been so generous with your time and your knowledge and helping all of us out who cover this great sport with your truly endless well of recruiting knowledge. Congratulations on your big career move. Thanks again for joining us. Take care, man.
Appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Would you say your biggest takeaway was the optimism that he, and I guess I should say, we're recording this, by the way, the day after Washington got its most recent commitment in the 2027 class from a linebacker named Isaiah Leilua, who I wrote about it on Montlake.com. You should go look at his huddle highlights. Start with his junior year, his sophomore year. This dude had 91 tackles as a freshman in the Trinity League, playing against Mater Dei and St. John Bosco, and a little bit smaller than the average linebacker recruit that they've gone after, which should tell you that like his skill kind of outweighs his size if they're going to take someone who's 6 foot and 220 pounds. They've got 8 guys committed in this class, and when Brandon Huffman talks about like the optimism of, look, they're in a great position with, at this point, it's not projection, right? I mean, they signed a 2026 class ranked 12th or 13th in the country.
Yes.
Early returns on 2027 are pretty strong.
The view, and I think the feeling from someone like me who doesn't avidly follow recruiting, is that Washington's done a good job and they're making progress, but they're not quite over the hump. And for someone like Brandon, who deals predominantly with sort of supply chain or the supply line of talent, he's looking at it and saying, okay, they've got through the players that they have in the pipeline and that they've got into the program and are going to get into the program. The Jedd Fisch is recruiting at an extremely high level, and it was his description of Damon Williams and how that situation looked nationally was exceptionally interesting to me, because I've seen that as a sign of, I don't know whether a sign of instability at the most important spot, like however you want to say it, that things went sideways there for a few days, and Washington's doing the best it can to try and steady the course. And Brandon's looking at it as like, man, you see very clearly how you got a very concrete demonstration of how firm their financial commitment is, where they're recruiting at, and the players that are coming. Jedd Fisch's work ethic and ability to recruit is really showing through.
The last question I asked him about, the calendar and is recruiting maybe less hectic or easier to follow. That came out of a recent Friends of the Program Zoom call where we had discussed on the show last week the idea that, like, hey, I think a lot of older fans especially are kind of tuning out on the granular details of high school recruiting. It's still as thriving and booming of an industry as ever, but there is a portion of the college football fan base that's like, wake me on signing day. I can't get excited about these guys till they're on campus because the game is so transient. And shout out to Coker, subscriber Coker, knows who he is.
I know Coker.
Yeah?
Coker greater than Pepsi, I think, is his Twitter handle.
Indeed. The man loves Coca-Cola. Devastating for him, I think, that the school recently switched to Pepsi. But he submitted that counter that I put to Brandon Huffman. He's like, no, actually, like, look at the calendar. It has become, I think, tidy is the right word. It's everything's a lot tighter now. You're not like having to track as many prospects. I think that the official visit calendar is so truncated. Like, sure, schools still give out hundreds of offers in a cycle, but exactly who they're after. The pool of like 40 or 50 guys that they really, really, really want. And so those guys are either going to be committed or not by, like Brandon Huffman said, by the 4th of July. And you're going to go into the summer and the season with really only a small handful of recruits left to keep track of until signing day. And then, like Washington, the last couple of classes on signing day or the 48 hours before signing day, another one or two sort of, maybe not out of nowhere, but you weren't expecting them to get. And so there's still that surprise factor. But I don't know. I thought that was an interesting response from, especially the idea that, like, not only are they agreeing to financial terms, but they're receiving allowances ahead of time, and that sort of binds them a little bit too.
Yeah, the allowances part was funny to me. Is like, are they fronting? We're going to front you a little bit of cash? The image that I got as Brandon was describing that was the movie Open Range. It's got Robert Duvall and Kevin Costner in it. But the colleges are increasingly, you've got a flock, but you don't have them penned up. And you're trying to keep them all corralled. And most of them are going to make it through, but you got to fight to keep as many as you can. You're not quite sure which ones are going to wander off, and that you're herding. That it's not a recruit class, it's a herd. You're riding herd on your group.
Chris Peterson once described coaching the freshman team at UC Davis as herding cats. Was first job.
Chris Peterson was someone who did not like the herding or the playing defense on your recruiting class.
No, he did not. But they were pretty good at it.
They were exceptionally good at it.
I think that was more of a front end evaluation thing where it was like, is this a kid who fits us? And part of fits us was, are we going to have to, stay on him 24 hours a day until signing day because he's going to entertain all these other calls from these other schools? Or is he the type who's going to be on board with, like, committing, shutting it down, and no, I'm done. My recruitment's over.
One of my favorite stories from that sort of stuff, it's from the Neuheisel era. So I don't know if you remember him. There was a lineman from Arizona. I think it was Clayton Walker was his name. And he was and it's signing day, Neuheisel started whining and complaining about negative recruiting and how other people were negative recruiting. And he specifically singled out UCLA as like, we'd have to hose Clayton Walker off after he'd talked to another school about how they were negative recruiting against us. and Bud Withers, Bud's one of my absolute favorite people that I've ever met in this business, and he's got a book out about the Apple Cup. He's written a number of books. Gonzaga
You're gonna have Bud
basketball.
on at some point.
Oh, I love Bud. Bud called Bob Toledo, who was UCLA's coach, and Toledo gave him the quote on the record. He goes, "I'll tell you exactly what I said to him," because Clayton Walker said to me, well, Washington's been telling me that you might end up getting fired at UCLA. And so I told him, well, if I get fired, you know who the first person in line for my job is going to be? It's Rick Neuheisel. It was one of the freaking, and so that went in the story in the Seattle Times. It's one of my favorite little back and forth things.
That's awesome. Back when you could,
great.
Back when you could actually get just get another conference head coach on the phone.
Well, it was clear that when Neuheisel was Washington's coach, and I should make it clear, I genuinely like Neuheisel. I think he's really funny and really pretty nice guy, but he was so disliked by other college football coaches, especially at that time, that guys, I don't know, there's just sometimes, and maybe it was because they thought he was smug or smarmy or some of the different ways that he recruited, because he pushed lines on recruiting, but guys wouldn't hesitate to dunk on him, and it made it very funny.
Got a question from Ian this week?
We do. Ian is taking a little bit of exception to our characterization of him. And then, well, you'll have to hear it. Here's our conversation with IP McFarland.
Okay. I haven't had a chance to defend the claims that I'm constantly negative from last week. And you know what? I'm not even going to. I'm not going to defend them. I'm just going to be content as the villain of this podcast. That I am now the Tim Curry of regional college football podcasting, which is what every kid aspires to be. As I vocalize that, the funny thing is that I was listening to last week's episode on my drive to work, and the two of you were actually saying interesting things, which is not your norm. Usually I just fast forward so I can hear 2 or 3 minutes of my own voice and then press delete and move on. But no, you actually held my attention last week when you were talking about the dynamic between Jedd Fisch and the way he looks at assistants, the way he looks at out of game play calling. I don't think he's giving that up anytime soon. But it leads to my question. What has 2 years in surprised you about Jedd? Because we came in with this set opinion of this guy is transient. He's going to be here 2 or 3 years to feather his own nest, and then he'll be gone. And maybe that's still the case, but I feel wildly different now than I did when he was hired, and I don't know that if I can completely quantify that, though. Our friends at Split Zone Duo happened to reach out just before I was recording this on Monday and asked my take on the vibes around UW football, which I wouldn't say they skewered, but they did make me feel quite small, and maybe made every UW football fan feel quite small, because my opinion is that Jedd's openness about the transient nature of the sport at this point has actually, in an odd way, earned him trust from the fan base, and it seems like the players. But love your take on all of it, the whole Jedd Fisch experience. I hope you guys have an absolutely terrible week. I hope you have Oregon Trail level illness. And I'll talk to you soon. Go Dogs.
He wished cholera on us. Is that what happened?
I think he did. It sounds like on Splitzo Duo, they talk about Ian as if he's too positive. So
That's funny.
maybe
That they
he's
think
threading
he's
the needle.
cute? That
He's
he think
threading the
that
needle accurately.
he thinks he's cute. I have been surprised by Jedd Fisch's ability to remain unwaveringly positive in his public pronouncements about the team. I think that the way he talks about his team is there's no grousing and there's no sort of feeling of if they just do what I say, or like we're doing the best we can with what we've got. Like I think he's pretty unflinchingly positive. And that is especially highlighted with the Damon Williams situation, because I don't think a lot of coaches would have approached that the way he did, and I'm still not sure how it'll turn out. Like how our fans, there are a chunk of fans that wish either Damon Williams had been more contrite or addressed it more directly, but it's very clear that Jedd Fisch, I mean, including we look at it as we didn't lose our quarterback in the transfer portal. A lot of other schools did. He is unwaveringly positive about it, and that takes some discipline. So I'm surprised, and I'm saying that in a positive sense, that he's been able to do that.
I think that's definitely something to highlight, though I don't know that I would say I'm surprised by it. I remember I think it was either his first or second Pac-12 media day at Arizona, and how, I guess, like straightforward about the realities of the game and NIL. And I remember like his opening statement during his time on the podium was like, we've taken players in the transfer portal, coaches in the transfer portal. We're looking for boosters in the transfer portal, fans in the transfer portal. So anybody who wants to come be a part of it, like, let me know. We're looking to, we're in acquisition mode. And so I don't know, just the way he talked about his program at a time when like they were not good at all.
Yeah.
And any excitement was about like recruiting in the future and projection and potential. I guess maybe I was a little surprised that someone with like such a lengthy NFL background so cuts the figure of a player's coach publicly, and I think probably is like that's how players would describe him. That we talked about this, right? They're very professional and like NFL aligned when it comes to how they're going to manage their roster, and they're not going to frankly like keep anybody around who can't help them win, and they're not going to bring anybody in who can't help them win, and like the decisions made are very objective and with a very specific goal in mind. But that I think the way he interacts with players and the way they treat players, I don't know, like everything being so player focused, and like our job is to give these guys every single thing that we can to help them win and help them have this like awesome experience. Again, like it's not like I thought he'd be the opposite of that, but I guess I didn't anticipate that being like such a central part of who he is as a coach.
It certainly, he's clearly drawn parallels to both Belichick and Carroll. The way he interacts with players is way more Carroll than Belichick. It just, including playing time. If there was a criticism last year, it was that he stuck by Jonah Coleman instead of giving Adam Muhammad more carries. And the fact that Jacob Manu, like they honored their commitment of when he wanted to play his final game. Those are not Belichick-like. Like that, Belichick never approached teams and playing time in that way, or showed that consideration for what his players wanted. I think I would echo what you just said, Christian.
I don't know if anything else really jumps to mind. I guess like just maybe how straightforward he is on certain subjects. Like you're not going to get a lot from him on more like X and O football type things, but off-field developments and budget and NIL and transfer portal and even like some depth chart things, right? Like he's very willing to tell you like, here's the battle at these positions, here's who we're looking at, this is going to be our secondary this year, this is going to be, this guy's coming in here to start, if this guy's healthy he's going to start, those type of things. I don't know that like it's ever terribly surprising information, but most coaches still wouldn't confirm it publicly, right?
Yeah, he's not coy for no reason. Because I think there are a lot of college coaches that are sort of play things close to the vest for no reason. I don't think Jedd Fisch gives away competitive advantages at all, but he's not quiet just to not give out any information.
I got to listen to that Split Zone Duo episode now to see what Ian was referring to.
It's when he was saying that, I was surprised. Like when he said that sort of Jedd's forthrightness has been sort of kind of bought him some equity with UW fans. I think that's true. My question for Jedd right now, or kind of how Washington fans feel about him, is there a scenario where can he, if he's what Washington fans feel is successful this season, will he still be here? Like has he gotten to the point where if they do win, like Washington fans expect or meet expectations this year, is there a scenario where he stays? And I think there is, but I think that there are a lot of fans who kind of feel like if he does win, like the expectations will be for this year, that he's probably gone. And that creates its own challenges and difficulties.
I think before we get to that point, the verdict is going to come in on his handling of the Devon Williams Jr. situation, because I don't believe that people can will render their final judgment on that until the season plays out. And either Williams is great and they win, or he's not and they don't, or some combination between the two extremes. Because there is still, I think, probably a not insignificant number of people, and I don't know that it's the majority necessarily, but who are not thrilled that it's just open arms, come on back, we're all good, and we move forward. And I don't know, I'm not going to say that's the right or wrong way to look at it. It's just a fact. There are people who look at it that way, who are not sold on the head coach's embrace of the quarterback who tried to leave the program. And so if they lose a game they shouldn't, if they're not, it's mid-November and they're not in the college football playoff picture, if they come up short of the CFP, it's still a bottom line business. If they win and they make the CFP, I think all will be forgiven. But I do think that the approach of, not to criticize the merits at all, but I do think the approach of look, at the end of the day, he's still here. We kept most of our roster. We're focused on the future. We're excited about the team we have. We're going to have a great year. I think it's sitting well enough now, but not with everybody. And I think depending on how the season goes, it could still be something that people pick apart and say, yeah, I don't love how this all went down.
In the best, sort of most optimistic sense, it reduces the margin for error. I think that's pretty unequivocal. If you take a more discerning look, it creates there's going to be a pressure and creates a possibility for legitimate backlash if there is disappointment pretty much at any level. I think you're right about that.
And also not terribly surprising that somebody with an NFL background moves on pretty quickly emotionally from, what was, I stopped short of comparing it to an NFL contract holdout. Because, this was literally someone under contract trying to leave to go play for another team. That doesn't happen in the NFL. That would never happen in the NFL. So it's not one for one. And he also wasn't a negotiating tactic. He was not trying to get more money from Washington by leveraging this offer. Maybe that happened during the negotiating process, but not at the point after which he'd signed the deal. So, but I think it falls in the same bucket, spiritually and in terms of the stress it puts on a head coach and on an organization to have especially your most important player going through that. So I think probably have an NFL experience made it pretty easy to be look, hey, this was 48 hours. We didn't have to pay a cent more than we'd already committed, and the guy's still here and the contract held up. So I've been in this business too long and seen too many things to get too bent out of shape over this when the outcome was exactly what we thought it was going to be before this whole saga happened.
Yeah, the pragmatic, and I think that's the approach that Jedd did take. The most pragmatic approach is to say there's nothing really going to be gained about dwelling on this. Even if sort of being more If we're taking him back, we have to make that decision and sort of lean all the way into it. Because the more we hem and haw or sort of have an act of contrition, public contrition that happens, if we start losing in October, it's not, nobody's going to go back and, well, at least at least everybody felt bad about it. Like, the stakes have already been made, and the best chance we have is to lean fully into this and push forward as hard as we can, because there's no other better outcome or better approach that's going to eliminate the downside that exists because of what happened. We can't change those 48 hours. We just got to push past them.
E plus R equals O, right? At the end of the day. Thanks again to Brandon Huffman for joining us.
It was really cool to talk to him.
Hope you enjoyed the interview with him. Hope you enjoyed the show. I think we'll talk to you next week.
Yes. Peace.